Let's rip the bandage off. Original sin is one of Christianity's most toxic ideas. It instills a sense of inherent guilt and unworthiness from birth, framing humanity as fundamentally flawed and in need of salvation through external means. This concept has not only fueled centuries of fear and control, but has also distorted how individuals view themselves and their potential, fostering a mindset of shame rather than growth. The notion that every human is born broken, doomed by an ancient ancestor's mistake, isn't just absurd, it's dangerous. But where did this idea come from? Did Jesus teach it? Did the apostles preach it? The answer is no. This absence is significant because it highlights that original sin was not rooted in the teachings of the early church. Instead, it emerged later, shaped by cultural, theological, and political influences. If Jesus and the apostles didn't consider it fundamental, how did it become central to Christian doctrine? Original sin wasn't part of Christianity until centuries after its birth. This concept originates not from God or Scripture, but from Augustine of Hippo, a 4th century bishop. Augustine, brilliant but flawed, was deeply haunted by his struggles with lust and guilt. In his famous work Confessions, he candidly described his inner turmoil, lamenting his inability to resist temptations of the flesh, which he perceived as a moral weakness. These personal battles heavily influenced his theological ideas, leading him to view human nature as inherently corrupt and in need of divine intervention. He took a symbolic story from Genesis, interpreted by many early Christians as a metaphor, and turned it into a doctrine of inherited guilt. According to Augustine, Adam and Eve's disobedience in the Garden of Eden didn't just separate them from God, it fundamentally corrupted human nature. Their sin, he claimed, was passed down like a spiritual disease to all of humanity. But where's the biblical proof? Augustine leaned heavily on Romans 5:12, where Paul writes, "Sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way, death came to all people." Sounds straightforward? Not quite. Paul's original Greek emphasizes death spreading because all sinned, not because Adam's guilt was inherited. Scholars argue Augustine misinterpreted Paul, twisting the text to fit his narrative. In fact, early Christianity didn't have this concept of inherited guilt. Early church writings, such as those of Irenaeus of Lyons, emphasized Adam and Eve's story as a narrative about human development and moral growth, not a declaration of universal corruption. Practices like baptism were viewed as acts of purification and commitment to faith, rather than remedies for inherited sin. Additionally, the Eastern Orthodox Church continues to interpret Adam's actions as introducing mortality and suffering, framing human nature as flawed yet capable of goodness, rather than fundamentally sinful. Eastern Orthodox Christians still reject it, viewing Adam's sin as introducing mortality and suffering into the world, not as a genetic curse. Judaism, which gave us the Genesis story, emphasizes personal responsibility. Your actions are your own, not Adam's or anyone else's. So, why did Augustine's idea stick? Power, control, and fear. Augustine lived during a time when the Roman Empire was collapsing, and the church sought to assert authority. Convince people they're inherently sinful, and they'll rely on the church for salvation. Original sin wasn't just theology, it was a political weapon. And Augustine didn't invent this concept from scratch. Ancient cultures were steeped in ideas of humanity's inherent flaws. In Mesopotamian mythology, humans were created by the gods to perform labor, and were seen as expendable, inherently flawed beings, burdened with mortality. Similarly, Greek mythology tells of Pandora, whose curiosity released suffering into the world, paralleling Eve's role in Genesis. These myths share a common thread. Humanity's imperfections are framed as inherent, unavoidable traits. Augustine's concept of original sin drew heavily from these cultural narratives, repackaging them within a Christian framework. In Mesopotamian mythology, humans were created as flawed laborers for the gods. In Greek mythology, Pandora's curiosity unleashed suffering upon humanity, echoing Eve's role in Genesis. Augustine simply repackaged these ancient oppressive myths into a Christian framework. This doctrine reshaped Christianity, turning sex into sin, pleasure into guilt, and human nature into something inherently flawed. Augustine's struggles with temptation became a template imposed on everyone. But here's the truth. Original sin is not biblical, not universal, and not necessary. It's a man-made idea, born out of guilt and a hunger for control. The story of Adam and Eve wasn't meant to condemn humanity. It's a tale of choices, consequences, and the complexity of life, not a declaration that every baby is born deserving hell. Long before Augustine wrote a word about inherited guilt, ancient civilizations were already telling stories about humanity's flaws. Augustine just gave these tales a theological spin that suited the church's agenda. It's time to see original sin for what it really is. A borrowed idea, reshaped into a doctrine that has caused centuries of guilt, control, and oppression. Recognizing its origins doesn't just challenge a toxic belief. It frees us to embrace a more humane understanding of ourselves and our faith.